Today's forum takes us into another area, an area of economic policy and the use of Nazi-style economic policies to relocate and to depopulate the poor of America's urban centers. I think that if people have taken a look at the press in recent days, you've seen more and more coverage of the loss of housing, which is impending and is beginning to accelerate because of the cutbacks in the federal budget. There's been about a 20% cut in housing and urban development's budget over the past 3 years, but there's also been, since November 11th or 12th of this month, an elimination and a gradual elimination of Section 8 housing. That's a particular category of subsidy, and we'll be hearing a lot more about that and related matters. But the issue is that in a period of increasing economic and financial collapse, in which we faced the largest financial collapse perhaps in history, there is no individual or local solution that can, in fact, roll back that form of collapse that we are now undergoing, except federal government intervention to utilize the powers of the federal government, particularly those of the Congress, to place the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States back under the Congress and to issue credit for various forms of infrastructure development, including housing. Today's panel will discuss these matters.
I began with housing when first working with Mr. LaRouche back in the mid-'60s. And I'll spare you most of my stories, but perhaps we'll get to some in the course of discussing what has happened to housing policy in the United States over particularly the period from the Second World War to the present time. And what we assert is that what has now been undertaken and has increasingly been the norm since the mid-1960s is a Nazi policy toward housing. Now, what does that mean? What that means is that there is a deliberate policy not to provide enough that not only you can afford. We left out one thing. We said affordable housing, also livable housing. Because one thing about the housing crisis in this country is that it is buried enormously under statistics, under moving people out of the cities where they can be seen, into the rural areas. There's a tremendous crisis which has been masked that people no longer are able to be unaware of until it erupts into mass death. But in fact, what you will find over this period of the last 30 years plus is a policy of deliberate elimination of housing at the lower end of the income scale, the increasing use of housing as a speculative financial instrument as opposed to something for people to live in, and therefore a policy which in fact dictates that this nation will not be able to raise the next generation as a continuation of our species, of our country. We will be reducing our population, carrying out genocide against our population if this housing policy is continued. In the LaRouche economic method, which is the only one which has fought the growth of Nazi economic policies in this country over the recent decades, it's important to realize that the fundamental unit of wealth is first the individual human mind, the creative human mind, and then the material conditions which will help to support that individual becoming a creative, productive individual capable of scientific discovery for the whole human race, not just their family. But every such individual is raised in another fundamental unit called the household. Now, funny thing about the household, it requires having a house. Now, and for more and more people, that is a problem. But the fact is that the conditions of the home, of the house, whether there's room to study, whether you are protected from the elements, whether you have electricity, whether you are able to know that you'll have the house from 1 month to the next month, all have an enormous bearing on the ability of the individual to develop him or herself as a productive human being. And beyond that, this unit of the household. So a productive society requires households, and we, in fact, in the LaRouche economic method, measure the ability of that society to grow and prosper by what it produces per household. How much electricity is produced per household, how much water, how much steel, clothing, so forth and so on, because that's what consumes it. The nurturing unit is the household. And forget about money for time being. We're talking about physically what's produced, which goes into nurturing the individual and the family, and which then produces the next generation, hopefully at a higher level of capability. Obviously, for this household to have the most productive capability, it needs something beyond itself. It needs an electricity supply, for example. It needs running water. I mean, we still have in the state of Virginia, and I'm sure it's even worse in the further south, a lot of areas which do not have running water. They may have electricity at this point thanks to FDR, but thanks to the government of Virginia, which hates to take government money unless it's for the people at the top, they don't have running water. So the infrastructure that is properly the role of government is required in order for a household to be able to function. And this is therefore why we have to be extremely concerned with this question of housing. People's right to have housing that will create conditions for a prospering family and a prospering nation. When FDR came to power to reverse the Depression in 1934, he talked about how a third of the nation was ill-fed, ill-housed, and unemployed, I believe. The housing was an absolutely central feature of this. And one of the first actions, in fact, that was taken was to establish the FHA, the Federal Housing Authority, which basically didn't build housing, but it did provide credit to keep people from being kicked out of their houses so that they were able to maintain a physical existence, hold body and soul together in the period that came up into the war. So we're dealing here with the fundamental building block of society, and therefore it says something when you have policymakers who, instead of talking about preserving the capabilities and enhancing the capabilities of households and increasing the number of households, start talking about reducing deliberately the ability of the country to populate, have families, and have housing. But in fact, that's what happened. At a certain point that started in the mid-60s, but became totally visible in the United States with Paul Volcker's interest rate increases at the end of the 1970s. The deliberate policy was Malthusian. The taking on the idea that we couldn't have any more people, we shouldn't have any more people, we have too many already for the resources that we have, and instead we should have economic policies in government which reduce the population. We have and this came very much to the fore at the time, because if anyone looked around, they saw that it was impossible to at the end of the 1970s, when Volcker had raised the interest rates to 20% or so, to build new houses, to refinance your house, to pay the interest rates on your house. You know, it looked like a deliberate policy. So we in the LaRouche movement decided to ask some people in government, well, is this a deliberate policy? I mean, look, what you're doing is preventing people, even businessmen. This wasn't a question of just the tenants or the homeowners. It was the businessmen who wanted to build housing at that time. I don't know if you recall, but they were all in such bad shape economically, they were sending 2x4s to Paul Volcker at the time, saying, you're destroying the construction industry, you're destroying our ability to build homes. So, and he would, you know, he said, forget it, I don't care, I know you're collapsing as an industry. Too bad. But so we decided to test what was going on here. The result of the policy was obviously a disaster. Was that the intent? Well, yes, indeed. We found out that was the intent. A Treasury Department source told us, someone at EIR in 1981, that we've allocated too much capital to housing in the United States. Now we have scarce resources, and this is all fine and good, because fewer homes mean Americans will have fewer children. Less space in apartments means smaller families, and that's good policy, because that's what we want. So let's go through just quickly what some of the physical parameters have been here. I'm going to start off with construction. Now, construction is the key. Keep in mind that New York example. Only when you have a massive shortage of housing can you force people to pay these absolutely exorbitant rents or mortgages to build up the banker's income. So the way we figure this is on the basis of production per household. It starts in 1963, goes through 1995, and as you can see that per household, we have gone way down, starting with a little less than 0.03 per household in 1963, and now down more than, we've gone down to more than 50%. Next. We have also massively increased the price at the same time. And this, in our latest market basket study for EIR, you can see this measured by how many paychecks it costs you to buy a new home. That has increased. We're not talking about strictly money, but how much time you have to work in order to buy a new home. You now have to put at least twice as much into it in terms of time as you did back in 1963. Next. As I said, the reason, however, that even new homes ownership has been growing as much as it has is because people are willing to give you a lot of credit, I mean a lot of debt. You may have noticed, as soon as you buy a house, you get 2 to 3 credit card offers a week. As far as I could see, they want you to borrow more. You're a sucker already, you're going to be more of a sucker. So this gives you has nothing to do with how good your credit, they want you to get into more debt. In fact, they like low-income people in particular who are very careful about paying on the monthly. Never pay it all off. They don't want you to pay it all off. Just pay that minimum amount for a long time and you'll get more debt. So anyway, this is very much the case with housing. And here you see how on the, move it up a little bit. The dark is your down payment on the housing from 63 to 93. The gray is the interest money, which, as you see, a bit outstrips the fundamental amount. And of course, that goes way up in the 80s as a direct result of this deliberate Malthusian policy to shut down the economy. Volcker's policy of raising the interest rates, and which led directly to destroying the savings and loans, which were some of the major, which were dedicated funders of new housing at a more reasonable level, was explicitly aimed at cutting down family formation and population in the United States. Thanks. This is the fall in new housing construction from 1970 to 1995. You're talking about the bottom, the darker, is multifamily units. The gray at the top is single family units. So you see here, this is 1.5 million. That goal of 1 to 1.5 million we're now undershoot of 1949. We are now underproducing at any level. And of course you have to realize this includes every level, right? It includes those huge $400,000 houses you see outside Washington, you know, down to the very, very cheap El Cheapo out in, you know, West Virginia. Go ahead. Here is a comparison of the how single-family home starts and how those are going down with the average new home price. Now, this is figured in money as opposed to how much you have to work for it. This is a fall in the percentage of new housing units that are multifamily. And what's important about that is not that we necessarily think there should be multifamily dwellings, although there are, I mean, more and more single-family homes or single-family apartments are becoming multifamily, simply because people cannot afford the rent that they have to pay right now. This is to the point of even late 19th century or worse conditions in New York City, where slave laborers are imported into the United States with free trade and, you know, are living 10 to a room and so forth. But multifamily units used to be quite respectable. Baltimore, for example, has a lot of duplex family areas which are quite reasonable, solid homes. Philadelphia also, working class areas. But they have been demoted as a percentage, whereas the high scale, higher indebtedness homes are being valued more and more. Now, in terms of measuring the amount of damage being done to families under these conditions of housing shortage, this is very hard to get. There are all sorts of figures that you have. They all have to understate the case. You have wildly varying pictures of homelessness, for example. One recent study said that whereas homelessness is figured at about 700,000 per day, if you took a snapshot on any particular day, it's about 7 million when you looked over a period of time, say a year in the late 80s, how many people were homeless. So it's extremely hard to get those figures on homelessness. We do have about 100 million households in the United States. As I said, about 63 million of those are supposed to be single-family home. 33 million are supposed to be rental units. Now, there was a study this spring by the Housing and Urban Development Department saying what their evaluation of the extremity that more and more families are in. And what they said is that the level of people who are poorly housed or ill-housed is the highest it's been historically, that it's at 5.3 million households. Most of those, and that's an increase of about, I think, 30% since 1991. It's rapidly rising. That what they mean by worst case housing needs, which is their formulation, not ours, includes two things. One is the inadequacy of the housing in terms of space, in terms of whether it has running water, in terms of whether it has electricity and toilets and so forth. And secondly, how much you're paying for rent. And their categories, are you paying 30 to 50%, or are you paying over 50% of your monthly income for rent? And what it comes out to, from the figures that we've been able to put together, is that if you took all the renters in the United States, now that's only a third, that about half of them are in this situation where they are paying over 30% of their monthly income for rent, or they're in public housing or some other kind of subsidized housing. So that's a situation which is obviously not as bad as a third of the nation ill-housed, but you can't tell. Because, as I said, the homeowner in the trailer in West Virginia is counted here the same as the guy in the 10-room mansion outside the nation's capital. So it would take a different kind of refinement to actually know what the conditions are for people. But there has been, this is by HUD's figures, it's the worst that it's been since it's been measured. It's post-war. Okay, now these are the renter households that are in precarious condition. This is what I just went through. This is 53% of the renter households either pay 31 to 50% of their income, over 31% of their income for rent, or receive some kind of government assistance for their housing. Either they live in public housing, or they actually get some kind of rent break. Now already, of course, it's been determined that people should get less rent break. Back in the 1960s, it was considered the standard by the government that you were paying the right amount for rent if you paid 25% of your monthly income. Now it's 30% of your monthly income, but a lot of people are paying a lot more than 30% of their monthly income. And of course, what this doesn't tell you at all is how many people are paying this for their house. I've joked with people, maybe the house owns them instead of them owning the house, right? Or the bank owns them. People say, well, you own your own house. So I said, well, really, the bank does. But this obviously doesn't reflect that because we just don't have the figures for it. But that's 53%. Go ahead. Now, as I said, the bubble of speculative money, the mortgages that were making those slums profitable in New York City, are now making the building of highly overpriced homes, also made more flimsily, profitable these days. And this gives you some of the growth of home mortgage debt, which has gone from take it from 75, under $500 billion, to now almost $3.5 trillion as part of the debt that's out there. I don't think you've seen many wages going up at quite that rate, except among a very small portion of the population. What's the next? That's it? So anyway, this is where I think I will stop. What is underscored here is the fact that housing is intimately tied to the financial bubble. The fact that as many homeowners as do live in their homes, as opposed to being out on the street, is related to them being able and willing to pay an enormous amount of interest on their mortgage. As the entire financial debt bubble comes to the point of implosion, which it increasingly is, that will pull the plug on this entire operation. And then the question is going to be whether we are mobilized and organized to get the federal government to provide credit to build new housing. Now, we always had the proposal that some of those empty office buildings in New York City should be opened up for housing. That's not a bad idea, but the question is the state of organization of the American people. Are they going to mobilize for the credit policy nationally to build the housing at the level when people can afford, for families, not for profit, for families, production? Or are they simply going to sit in their cold, unlighted house, you know, and starve to death? Thank you.
Let me begin with a word of advice. If a professional academic expert in so-called urban planning or urban renewal or urban development comes knocking at your door, whether you're an ordinary citizen or a responsible public official, slam it in his face. Because whether he knows it or not, and whether you know it or not, the axiomatic principles behind his thinking and training are based upon a policy of genocide. That was the clear and explicit intent of the financier oligarchs who began the urban renewal game in the United States in the late 1950s. In the name of cleaning up urban blight and using public funds and governmental powers to promote low-income or affordable housing, they set out to destroy America's industrial centers. Their objective was to reduce the United States to a post-industrial society, freed from the carrying charges of sustaining a once productive workforce. According to this insane British utopian scheme, collapsing the tax base for funding public schools, hospitals, sanitation, and transportation would hasten the demise of what they fashionably termed the underclass. Demolishing or rehabbing the only affordable housing for such undesirables in favor of new opportunities for real estate speculation would ensure that the cities would be depopulated. Most of you will recognize that the intolerable conditions now prevailing in cities throughout the nation are very similar to what the originators of urban renewal intended 40 years ago. But to eradicate these conditions, you must eliminate the axioms which underlie the national disaster known as housing policy today. Then you can slam the door on the werewolf in sheepskin clothing. So who begat this murderous policy of urban renewal? The same oligarchical families of New England who opposed the American Revolution, who made their fortunes as opium traders for the British Empire, who supported treason against the United States during the War of 1812, and who played the British game against the Union in the Civil War. Their defective line also begat traitor Aaron Burr, the murderer of Alexander Hamilton, Prescott Bush, a supporter of Adolf Hitler, who begat Coke King George, and McGeorge Bundy, a Lowell, who first begat the genocidal Vietnam War, and then the SDS terrorists known as the Weathermen. These are not the sort of people with whom you should discuss better housing. Especially in Boston, where their rage against New England's crucial role in our War of Independence from Britain still has them foaming at the mouth. These latter-day redcoats were determined to make the destruction of Boston an example for the whole country. They don't wear British uniforms today, but once you know how to identify them, they can still be put to rout. Boston's Anglophile elite, using experts from Harvard and MIT, established a system of massive tax fraud to underwrite a high-rise speculative orgy in downtown Boston while crushing the city's vital services and productive infrastructure. The official apparatus included the Boston Model Cities Agency and the Boston Redevelopment Authority, backed by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, generally known as HUD, not the movie, and the Massachusetts Housing Finance Agency, the MHFA, generally known as EVIL. The semi-official apparatus included the Citizens Housing and Planning Association, the law firm of Hill and Barlow, and the Limits to Growth Planners of Massachusetts Tomorrow Incorporated. Former Massachusetts Governor Dukakis, remember him? He'd be among the few people who do, appointed key figures from all of these agencies and institutions to leading posts in his administration on behalf of the same policy-making elite which stands today behind Governor William Weld. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, before Dukakis became governor in 1975, his cronies were at the center of a vast real estate swindle using federal, state, and city funds intended for low-income housing development. This same machine and the blue blood financial elite which controls it also established a system of fraudulently undervaluing their huge commercial real estate holdings, thereby cheating the city of hundreds of millions of dollars annually in needed revenues. Now, how did this happen? Under deliberate policies of disinvestment and deindustrialization following World War II, the resulting collapse of Boston's productive tax base left the city in a severe fiscal crisis by the late 1950s. The blue blood financial interests which had imposed the policies then moved in for the kill, offering the city the choice of either bankruptcy and government by receivership or submission to the vast looting schemes to be known as the New Boston. The second option anticipated using federal and state funds to underwrite a large portion of the operation. So on a summer day in 1959, over cocktails at the Harvard Club, the genocidal scheme known as urban renewal was set into motion. There were some very important gentlemen at that meeting at the Harvard Club. Ralph Lowell, chairman of the board of Boston Safe Deposit and Trust Company, and Charles Coolidge, who managed the legal affairs of Thomas Cabot, were among those who plotted to form a permanent financial dictatorship over the city of Boston. They also represented the same families who'd established the treasonous World Federalists in the United States not long before America's entry into World War II. The discussions begun at the Harvard Club in 1959 led to the creation of the Vault, designed to rule the city like a council of Venetian doges. The leading bankers, and thus the Vault, were included, of course, New England Merchants, State Street, Shawmut, First National Bank of Boston, now the Bank of Boston. And with a little help from their friends at the Boston Globe, the Vault wrecked the 1959 re-election campaign of Mayor John Powers and reinstalled their own man, John Collins. Now the perpetrators of the great urban renewal hoax were rolling at full steam.
If you want to understand what gentrification is about, it's business. It's basically about the dollar. When the land becomes too expensive for the poor to occupy, then it's time to move them out. It's supply and demand. Now, why would you want to keep affordable housing on the acres of land that is producing under Section 8 housing, $200,000 a year on taxes, when you could put the Prudential of 50 stories that pay you $7.5 million a year on taxes, but also generates for you $70, $80 million in sales tax. So that is $100 million a year revenue. The land is too expensive for you to live on it. So what the Boston Development Authority does, they move every 10 years. So they take over a neighborhood every decade and they totally demolish it, and they wait for the demand of the investors and the money already allocated. So we're talking about a multi-billion dollars investment here. What is the Boston Development Authority all about, first of all? It's an architectural agency. So if you hire an architect and you say to them, we want to get rid of crime, and one way to get rid of crime is to get rid of affordable housing. Because if the poor cannot afford to live in the city, you have no crime. Only the elitists could live in the city. That's simple. So that reduces that part. We don't have to worry about it. Second is we need to bring a class of people in to invest in our city and make it one of the most expensive cities in the country. So no one could afford to come in and live in it. Recently, I predicted, and I have been written in many of the articles, that affordable housing will not survive the 90s. My daughter is in England. She worked with me. She just graduated Cambridge University, and now she's writing her thesis on LSE, and the title of it, The Death of Affordable Housing in America, because she's been doing that research for 10 years. And I'm very proud of her. She discussed that with me last night. What's happening in America? This year here today, I have a Section 8 on Mandela that 15 years. I purchased Mandela in 1981. That Section 8 expires in 1996 November. In the same time, over 4 million units will expire the same day. Now HUD, because of the election on most of the units, because the Clinton administration, they want to make sure they're not going to create affordable housing, panicky in the country. So they gave an automatic extension only for 1 year. Secretary Cisneros on CNN, he admitted there will be 3,700,000 units will be off the Section 8 and going to the voucher system. Now, if you take that, you're talking about 12 million American people right now. Within next year, there will be homelessness, addition to what we already have. So we do have some serious crisis here. Now, the question is, in my mind, being controversial on real estate and fighting with HUD and the BRA and the Department of Revenue and the City of Boston, I'll get them all. I've spent 15 years in courts. What is the real agenda? Why they cannot basically turn those units for $1 to tenant ownership? Now, Boston, under the Clinton administration, because of Senator Kennedy and Kerry, frankly, they brought in $500 million to affordable housing. My neighbors, Mission Hill, they were getting $50 million as a gift for 800 units. I predicted back in 1992, when they got the money, that they're going to demolish Mission Hill, although they got $50 million to it. Today, what do you think they're doing? They're demolishing Mission Hill. Now, you have to ask yourself, as a taxpayer, if we're giving away $50 million, why are we demolishing 800 units, and who are we spending the money on? That money is going to satisfy gentrification. That money is going for the BRA. Did that money really, taxpayers' money, which was allocated to Section 8 housing, to every unit, did it really go into the developments to protect the tenants? It did not. It went into put gas lights, brick sidewalks, landscaping. If you take a look at the architectural, you say, this is a palace. That's not affordable housing. Where's the money going? So I came out and I written back to the media and I said, I got a plan. I says, why don't we take each unit in Mission Hill and deed it to the tenants for $1? I mean, I don't understand the tenants. If you have a gift of a lifetime, you don't have to support the interest or the principal. Why should you become an owner? Why should anybody manage you? I have a problem with that. I mean, I keep saying to myself, I'm rich. I get the money. It's my money. The Congress appropriated. They brought it in. The headline said this is a gift. We got to save affordable housing. Did that money go into affordable housing? No. Where did it go? To displace 3,000 people on the street. That's how many people live in Mission Hill. So we know that. What we got to do about it? Now, the other side, we have another development, Archie Park, 740 units. Senator Kennedy and Senator Kerry brought another $50 million. You know what's happening to that after 20 years? It's going to be demolished. My neighbors cross street, Roxy Home, they brought in, I know some of you read the $200 million lately in the Boston Globe, $100,000 a unit for rehab, and they said they're going to reduce these ones by 50%. Well, what's going on here? So all of a sudden, you got about 4,000 units in Roxbury. It's being reduced to about 900 units for $500 million. So where's the economics here? You see, I know what the agenda is. My problem is, what are we going to do about it? I have no problem what they're doing. I expect them to do this. But the question here in this room, we gather this information, we know this, But what are we going to do? The federal government has failed. In the last 20 years, we have gone from bad to worse. And the latest blueprint from HUD, they admitted that we want to get out of business because we don't know how to run it. We have no business to be in it. They admit it. Sister Nero said, I'm going to run. I don't want to manage any more housing, so I'm going to give you certificates. I'm going to give you a voucher. But how could you give certificate and a voucher when you're reducing the housing stock, existing housing stock, that we already paid for? For example, if we got already today 500 units that taxpayers paid for, well, how could you demolish it, and where are you going to take those 500 units? They'll probably occupy several million people, or where are you going to put them? So why can't, I'm a businessman, why don't we protect what we already paid for? See, the problem today, we should freeze all the housing that's already paid for that the federal government is willing to give to a private developer for $1 in order to make a killing at affordable housing at the poor. The rich is getting richer. And how are they getting richer? In the poor. The only capitalism left in America is housing, because we inflated everything else. That's the only place you can make a marketable from 100 to 1,000% is housing. Because where could you buy a unit for $1 through gentrification and sell it at a luxury condominium for 100,000, 200,000 at a taxpayer's expense?
Not only do I serve on that housing committee, I am in the real estate business in Georgia. So I get involved in housing on a daily basis. But one thing that I often think about when I think about housing, in 1979, as a 20-something-year-old father and husband, I bought my first home in Southern California, in San Diego. The home was built in 1952 and sold for $10,000. In 1969, I purchased that home for $17,500. And would you believe, 10 years later, in 1979, when I sold that home, I sold it for $80,000. Now, during that period of time, that is when real estate stopped being real estate and became a speculative tool for financiers. There is no way on God's earth that in a 10-year span that house should have increased by some 500, 600% plus. But the value of the house did. The key to home ownership is having the purchasing power to purchase a home, and having some government involvement where need be in purchasing that home. Over the last, well, really since the 1800s, when land grabs took place, the government has been involved, the federal government has been involved in home ownership. HUD, VA, FHA, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, all of those agencies are involved in home ownership. To go out and purchase a home using conventional methods, you would normally have to pay 10, 20% or more down. But during that period of time, in the last almost 20 years now, since 1979, 1980, the housing situation has been altogether different in terms of how housing is marketed. I have a problem in my county right now. One day, one of my fellow commissioners walked in and he says, you know, we need 2-acre lots in all of our subdivisions. I mean, God darn, man, everybody don't want 2 acres. Some folk can't afford 2 acres. And then on that 2 acres, we don't need anything smaller than a 1,500 square foot house. Now, what do I need with a 1,500 square foot house 10 years down the road when I'm almost 65 and don't want to sweep, cut grass, wife don't want to cook, we're going to eat out, eat at the Senior Citizen Center. What do we need with that much house? We need a bedroom, someplace to sit and watch television, and someplace to park the car when we get ready to go see the kids. But 1,500 square feet on 2 acres. In today's dollars, in Georgia, in the community that I live in, that is a $130,000 house. That is a $130,000 house. Now, that's cheap, but it's relatively inexpensive if you look at what's out there. But the bottom line is, how many folks can afford to pay that much for some place to live? I mean, especially when you live in an economy like our economy in my town, in my county, where we've got 15% of the working poor are temporary employees. But folk, we have got to send a message to the federal government, to the state and local governments, to tell them what it is that we want. To tell them what it is that we want, and not what it is that they think we ought to have. As a county commissioner, as I said, I serve on the Housing Committee as vice chairman of the subcommittee for housing for the National Association of Counties. And I would be honored to take anything that the Schuler Institute wants to send that will help the people of this country on housing. With that, I'm going to sit down.
The first time I remember seeing a homeless woman was somewhere around, and knowingly, and I say knowingly because I know they were probably downtown and I probably had seen them, but I saw her right down the street from my house. And I was building a laundry business, and she passed by there. And I said, "Hello, how are you?" And she turned around and looked at me and replied, "What do you care?" I went to the back of the store, and I just cried and cried and cried. And I said, except for the grace of God, there goes my mother, there goes my sister, or one of my daughters. And I quickly wiped the tear from my eyes, and I ran after her. And I said, "Look, I didn't mean to be offensive. I just wanted to know if there was something that I could do." She said, "I'm hungry." I said, "Okay." I went to the restaurant across the street, and I asked the owner, I said, "Any day this lady comes," and I said, "come here anytime you wish and eat." And I said to the owner, "Run me a tab, and any day that she comes here to eat, feed her." And he did. And I was happy because I really didn't know what else to do. But I was at least happy that I could help her to eat. And then I look around and I say, how are we getting to this point? My friend talked about the prudential legislation, chapter 121A. I remember, I was not in the legislature, but I remember Chapter 121A. I remember when the Prudential was built. I remember the takeover of the South End, but not just the South End of Boston. There are South Ends all over the United States of America. And I remember Aunt Martha, my auntie, who had a property at 36 Rutland Square. And I remember when Ed Logue's people, under the direction of Mayor Collins, that he talked about this morning, said that they were going to tear down those buildings. Well, let me tell you what happened. They withdrew the funds. They did not clean the streets. They didn't pick up the trash on time. They allowed prostitution to prevail, and they allowed other illegal activities in the area which downgraded the property. And then they said, we have an urban blight, and we have to clean it up. When I talk about Boston, I want you to understand, it happened in Cleveland. It happened in Detroit. It's even happening in Detroit today. I was there in 1985 and 86 when Mayor Young began to tear down those houses. And I went to him personally to prevail upon him not to do it. But he had gotten a grant to tear down the housing, when in fact there were homeless people in 1985 and 86 in Detroit right at that time, and they could have turned those properties over, rehabilitated them, and put those people in there so they'd have a permanent place to live, and cut down on some of the crime rate and some of the prison population that they wanted to house people in the first place. I'm hoping that when we leave here today, that we will go to our respective communities and tell the powers that be, whomever it is, whether it's the local housing board, whether it's the city council, whether it's the state legislature, we will tolerate your foolishness no more. It is an inalienable right that every person must have a place to live that is decent and one that is affordable. And I thank you for this opportunity. I hope you've enjoyed what these lovely people have had to say, and I hope you will invite us to come again so that we'll be able to respond in some way positively to the detrimental situation that is happening in the lives of so many people. Thank you very much.
Today's forum takes us into another area, an area of economic policy and the use of Nazi-style economic policies to relocate and to depopulate the poor of America's urban centers. I think that if people have taken a look at the press in recent days, you've seen more and more coverage of the loss of housing, which is impending and is beginning to accelerate because of the cutbacks in the federal budget. There's been about a 20% cut in housing and urban development's budget over the past 3 years, but there's also been, since November 11th or 12th of this month, an elimination and a gradual elimination of Section 8 housing. That's a particular category of subsidy, and we'll be hearing a lot more about that and related matters. But the issue is that in a period of increasing economic and financial collapse, in which we faced the largest financial collapse perhaps in history, There is no individual or local solution that can, in fact, roll back that form of collapse that we are now undergoing, except federal government intervention to utilize the powers of the federal government, particularly those of the Congress, to place the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States back under the Congress and to issue credit for various forms of infrastructure development, including housing. Today's panel will discuss these matters.
I began with housing when first working with Mr. LaRouche back in the mid-'60s. And I'll spare you most of my stories, but perhaps we'll get to some in the course of discussing what has happened to housing policy in the United States over particularly the period from the Second World War to the present time. And what we assert is that what has now been undertaken and has increasingly been the norm since the mid-1960s is a Nazi policy toward housing. Now, what does that mean? What that means is that there is a deliberate policy not to provide enough that not only you can afford. We left out one thing. We said affordable housing, also livable housing. Because one thing about the housing crisis in this country is that it is buried enormously under statistics, under moving people out of the cities where they can be seen into the rural areas. Unit of wealth is first the individual human mind, the creative human mind, and then the material conditions which will help to support that individual becoming a creative, productive individual capable of scientific discovery for the whole human race, not just their family. But every such individual is raised in another fundamental unit called the household. Now, funny thing about the household, it requires having a house. Now, and for more and more people, that is a problem. But the fact is that the conditions of the home, of the house, whether there's room to study, whether you're protected from the elements, whether you have electricity, whether you are able to know that you'll have the house from 1 month to the next month, all have an enormous bearing on the ability of the individual to develop him or herself as a productive human being. And beyond that, this unit of the household. So a productive society requires households, and we, in fact, in the LaRouche economic method, measure the ability of that society to grow and prosper by what it produces per household. How much electricity is produced per household, how much water, how much steel, clothing, so forth and so on, because that's what consumes it. The nurturing unit is the household. And forget about money for time being. We're talking about physically what's produced, which goes into nurturing the individual and the family, and which then produces the next generation, hopefully at a higher level of capability. Obviously, for this household to have the most productive capability, it needs something beyond itself. It needs an electricity supply, for example. It needs running water. I mean, we still have in the state of Virginia, and I'm sure it's even worse in the further south, a lot of areas which do not have running water. They may have electricity at this point thanks to FDR, but thanks to the government of Virginia, which hates to take government money unless it's for the people at the top, they don't have running water. So the infrastructure that is properly the role of government is required in order for a household to be able to function. And this is therefore why we have to be extremely concerned with this question of, there's a tremendous crisis which has been masked that people no longer are able to be unaware of until it erupts into mass death. But in fact, what you will find over this period of the last 30 years plus is a policy of deliberate elimination of housing at the lower end of the income scale, the increasing use of housing as a speculative financial instrument as opposed to something for people to live in, and therefore a policy which in fact dictates that this nation will not be able to raise the next generation as a continuation of our species, of our country. We will be reducing our population, carrying out genocide against our population if this housing policy is continued. In the LaRouche economic method, which is the only one which has fought the growth of Nazi economic policies in this country over the recent decades, it's important to realize that the fundamental